Okay. So welcome everyone to tonight's constitutional conversation, sponsored by the Constitutional Law Center. Tonight we are coming in an international flavor, but with an issue that is, troubles the United States as well as so many democratic countries around the world. And it's my pleasure to welcome as our speaker tonight Pamela San Martín from Mexico City. She is a human rights lawyer who served for 6 years on Mexico's National Electoral Commission. And this is significant really in two ways, because Mexico has been, over the last quarter century, one of the great success stories of transition from a one-party state into a functioning two-party or multi-party democracy. And the Electoral Commission has been recognized truly the Mexican Electoral Commission, that is, Pamela's commission, has been recognized worldwide for its excellent work in bringing about free and fair elections, and thus is a real exemplar. But the second reason is that in recent months, and I'm sure Pamela will be talking a bit about this, the country seems to be moving in the opposite direction. So, including shutting down the Electoral Institute. So, we'll hear about this, but we at the Con Law Center invited Pamela because we do we're concerned about democracy and elections in the United States now, but we thought it would be good to have a bit of an international perspective, so we can see not just be U.S. centered in these problems, but see how other countries are addressing that, and especially the very successful tenure that Pamela and her colleagues had at the Mexican National Institute. So please join me in welcoming Pamela San Martín. The kind of more personal note to me is that Pamela and I are colleagues together on the Facebook or Meta oversight board, which is how we've gotten to know one another. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. First of all, thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Stanford University School of Law, the Constitutional Law Center, for this invitation, because I agree that it's a very relevant topic that is relevant to beyond Mexico and beyond Latin America, or beyond some of the countries that have received assistance from the Electoral Institute in Mexico, because it has to do with democratic transitions and democratic backslides. So let me just give you a little... Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Is the sound okay?
Or should I speak louder? Okay, I'll try speaking louder. When international observers who come to Mexico to monitor our elections, they are often struck by the complexity and the technical proficiency of our electoral system. For example, they're often amazed that in Mexico, elections are run on volunteers, which are randomly selected, and to ensure that there's no party undue influence on polling stations. For example, U.S. specifically is usually surprised to hear that in Mexico, companies cannot donate money to political parties or candidates. They cannot buy political ads. There are caps to the amount of money that political parties or candidates can spend on an election. There's caps on the amount of money an individual can donate to a campaign. They're also usually stunned by the fact that in Mexico, political parties' campaigns cannot buy political ads. They are allotted times through state-sponsored times so that they can broadcast those political ads, and the electoral authority has recordings on all the transmissions on radio and TV so that we can monitor compliance to our strict campaign rules. And this is part of a history of reforms which have made a very robust frame set in Mexico to regulations, but to counter what? To counter distrust on elections, to expunge a history of electoral fraud that is part of our story. And I would start clarifying, going on what Michael said at the beginning, that if I had given this talk 6 months ago, it would probably have been substantially different, because we would only be talking about the complex regulation we have in Mexico, about why we have that regulation, what its impacts are on democratic processes. But things have changed in the last few months in Mexico. The permanence of the guarantees we have built for over 30 years in Mexico are now in the balance. And it allows us to see how fragile democratic advances can be, even in countries that have prided themselves from having very strong procedural and institutional democracies. And I know this is a very complex issue, and I'll try to be as clear as possible, and I hope in the Q&A, if something wasn't clear, I'll be able to clarify it. But let me just start saying that electoral rules and procedures are very important in Mexico, and they're very important because they're the means to guarantee reliable results, to have trustworthy elections. Political scientists say that a democracy is consolidated when it's the only game in town. Well, in Mexico today, it's the only game in town because of those rules and because of those procedures that we have set in place. Today, no political actor will try to seek power outside of the elections. And that's how we managed to have that. But let me explain a little bit where we come from. In the year 2000, Mexico had its first alternation in power. After 70 years of hegemonic ruling of the political party, the PRI, we call it in Mexico. It's the party of the institutionalized revolution. That's the way it's called. The PRI was like the centerpiece to the authoritarian regime that Peruvian writer Mario Vargas Llosa called the perfect dictatorship. Why did it call it the perfect dictatorship? Because it was such a stable and long-lasting authoritarian regime. And in the center of that regime, the defining characteristics was that there was no checks on the presidential power, apart from the fact that it had a 6-year fixed term. Contrary to ordinary dictatorships that have one individual in the helm of power, in Mexico, we had elections every 6 years, and every 6 years, the sitting president would leave, and there would be no re-election after our revolution. But it was a very undemocratic system, because there was no uncertainty in who would win the elections. We always know that the pre-candidate would never lose the election. The electoral process was unfair, the rules were completely opaque, the playing field was completely tilted in favor of the PRI, who used even public resources against unfunded opposition political parties. But in order for us to understand this transition and what happened later, there's 3 ideas that are very important. 1, in Mexico, we cannot understand the transition to democracy outside of the constitutional reforms that gave place to that transition to democracy. And we cannot understand those constitutional reforms if we don't see them in the light of the electoral process that was previous to that constitutional reform, because it explains why we made that change. Because it usually was a response to post-electoral conflict. We had a post-electoral conflict, we made a constitutional reform to address that conflict. Second, the opening of Mexico's transition to democracy started in 1977. The change in power in the political party that had governed Mexico took more than 20 years. Why did that happen? 1976 is a key watershed to understand this. Because in 1976, no opposition candidate ran in the election. There was only one candidate running, and it was the PRI's candidate, José López Portillo, and he won. We can say that. But, of course, this didn't end up being a legitimate win. And the PRI addressed the fact that they did not want that to happen ever again, because they had less legitimacy in their presidency. So the PRI started a dynamic that it repeated election after election. It always gave in to the opposition enough changes, enough reforms for the opposition to stay calm, but for nothing to change, for them to keep maintaining or controlling power. That is, our transition to democracy was not because we thought it was a good idea. It was because it was a successive effort of trying to gain a little bit more. But doing this, what PRI achieved was setting the framework of the opposition into the electoral system, an electoral system that was very much tilted in favor of the PRI. And the third thing that is very important to understand is that there are two key issues that very much explain Mexico's transition to democracy. One, the lack of trust in elections, in their results, in electoral authorities, which it explains why one of the first and biggest changes we had was creating an autonomous body who could be charged with organizing the elections and that had very strict rules. A body that was built on the pillars of professionalizing the electoral officials and using citizens to oversee or control the elections. And the second key concept is the pursuit by the opposition to guarantee a level playing field. And one of the first things that happened for us to be able to guarantee a fair level playing field was the 1994 elections. In 1994, Ernesto Zedillo won the election. He was, of course, a pre-candidate. He won by 49% of the vote. That's one of the few elections during the pre-regime that is actually not contested, not even by the opposition. It is recognized that Zedillo won the election. But after winning the election, Zedillo said that it was a clean and transparent election, but that it was unfair. Because PRI used all the budget, all the federal budget, or all the budget from the state to compete. And the opposition had absolutely no funding. So what the opposition demanded and achieved was a finance model in Mexico that is preponderantly state-dependent. Most of the money political parties receive in Mexico is given by the state, and there are tons of limits to private funding of campaigns, and there's caps to how much political parties and candidates can spend. But let's go back to 2000, when we already have the autonomous body, when we already have state financing, and we have the first win that is not the PRI. Who wins the election is PAN, the National Action Party in Mexico. Then in Mexico we had like this enormous desire to transition to democracy. So we understood alternation, or we wanted to understand alternation, as a synonym of democracy. So even though rules were still not very fair, we put all our discussions aside having to do with the electoral model, and it's the first presidential election that does not have an electoral reform after the election, because we thought we were there. We were already a very democratic country. Our problem was 6 years later, the next election we had. And that hit us very hard because we thought we were there already. But what happened on the next election? In 2006, the shortcomings of the electoral model emerged clearly. There was huge intervention in those elections from three actors: private actors, the president himself, and media outlets. Private actors with huge campaigns saying that the opposition candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO we call him in Mexico, that is today's president in Mexico, that he was a danger to Mexico. The president using political propaganda, governmental propaganda, and the media outlets selling and allocating spaces for the different candidates at differentiated costs and times, like to benefit the official candidates. But this was worsened by the fact that the difference in that election was 0.56% of the vote. That means that there was a difference of 250,000 votes between the first and the second place. And a request from the second place in the elections for a total recount of votes, which the Electoral Authority did not heed into. So we had massive protests on the streets. We had a sit-down in Reforma. Reforma is the main avenue in Mexico City. And we had a sit-in there for 47 days. That when I actually checked, it was 47 days. I would have honestly thought it was 6 months, if not a lifetime, because it seemed like a lifetime at the time. But again, to channel the dissatisfaction of what happened in that election, what did we do? We changed our communications model. That's why we have this rule that political parties and candidates or third parties cannot buy political advertising. And we also established that there could be no governmental intervention in political campaigns or electoral campaigns. Then we go to 2012, where again, we go back to the PRI, with a 7% difference this time to, again, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. But this time, all the questioning that was around the election had to do with the amount of money the PRI candidate had spent on the election, if he had exceeded the campaign expenditure caps. And at the same time, we had local elections happening, and there was a lot of questioning about the interference of the governors in the local elections. This becomes relevant because in response to that, in 2014, we make another reform where we change the Electoral Institute precisely to make it a national institute and not a federal institute. Just a quick explanation. Mexico is a federal republic, so it's the logic of its electoral authorities prior to 2012 was that we had a federal electoral authority that would be in charge of organizing presidential elections, Senate and House of Representatives, and we had local authorities that would be charged with local elections. The difference is that we had the federal authority had all this background, all these rules, all these procedures, which most of the local authorities did not have. There were big differences. So trying to have something more equitable in the country, we created the INE, el INE, that is the National Electoral Institute, through the 2014 reform, that is charged with being the governing electoral authority over the 32 local electoral authorities from the states. But it also created an auditing, finance auditing model that tried to be completely expedite. What the reform sought was for the authority to be able to audit finance, campaign expenditures from the candidates 40 days after the election, so we could have a result before they took office. Because if they had exceeded campaign expenditure caps, if they had received the money that was not permitted in that election in large amounts, you could nullify the election. And in this framework we come to the 2018 elections. Again, 2018 we have alternation, this time to the left. And AMLO won by 53% of the vote, with a difference of 30 points between him and the second place, that was Ricardo Anaya. I mean, it was a clear win, no way around that. But there's 4 things that are worth highlighting about that election. First, it's the first time that Andrés Manuel ran through another political party, Morena. Second, Morena was a newly created political party. Morena was created in 2014, because in Mexico you can only create political parties once every 6 years. But before it was a political party, it was a movement for people to defend other people's vote, coming out of 2006 elections. And this movement is what political scientists call a personalistic party. I mean, it is structured completely around the president, not around the party itself. Third, in 2018, Morena not only won the presidential election, They won a majority of the Senate and 2/3 of the House of Representatives. Today, they only have a majority in the House of Representatives, but in 2018, I mean, it was complete. They won everything. And that meant that they could pass laws without even speaking to the opposition. They could approve budgets without speaking to the opposition. They could appoint high-ranking officials without speaking to the opposition. And the fourth thing is that as a result of the margin of difference of the victory, the opposition parties have blurred in the national scene. The Morena and AMLO are governing today with fewer checks and balances than any of their predecessors because the opposition parties are very much out of the picture right now. So we have this transition to democracy has been based on rules and procedures. And just let me exemplify what we mean by rules and procedures when we say that we have very strict and very robust rules and procedures. Let me give you an example. Voter ID. In Mexico, the electoral authority is the one charged with giving citizens the voter ID. That is doubled with a national ID. We don't have another ID that is not the voter's ID. The electoral authority has made serious tasks. We have working groups with political parties to guarantee that we have an accurate voting roll. Because the voting roll also is what will be the basis, not only of the election, it'll be also the basis of where we place polling stations. But very much related to the voter ID, we have the electoral geography, where you trace the lines between districts, how you construct a district. We have worked very hard, we have set procedures in Mexico so that the only criteria to draw districts are technical criteria, mainly population-based. We use some geography, we use some cultural elements, some social elements, but it's mainly population-based. Every time we have a population census, we redistrict, we draw the lines again. And when we draw these lines, it's literally, you put all the information, population-wise, geography-wise, into a computer, and the computer draws a line with no interference, precisely for it not to be biased in the representation it can achieve. And you have supervision of all the political parties throughout the process. Polling stations and polling officers. In Mexico, we install about 160,000 polling stations throughout the country. The premise is trying to get polling stations closer to where people are, not making people move to the polling station, but bringing it closer to them. Of course, this has enormous logistic complexities, but it facilitates people's right to vote. And then who receives votes? The polling officers are, as I told you, selected randomly by a double draw, but they are Mexican citizens that are our neighbors. For us to be able to have trust in that our votes will be counted well, who receives our votes are our neighbors. We know them. That is the logic behind their selection, and they, of course, are trained by the Electoral Institute. But just to give you the numbers, in 2018 elections, we visited 15 million people to draw 1.5 million polling station officers that would receive the vote randomly. Voting ballots. This one it's always amazing to me. Voting ballots in Mexico are printed on security paper in a national security facility with restricted access and permanent military custody. Once counted and organized, the exact number of ballots that have to go to an electoral district are sent with military custody. When they arrive at the electoral district, they are received by the authorities in the district, the electoral authorities in the district, with the political parties. They are counted, stamped, organized, and put into a warehouse where they have, again, military custody. The day of the election, before the election, again, they are counted by the polling officers with political parties. After the elections, the ballots that were not used and the votes that were casted are counted. If there's discrepancies, it'll be recounted in the district. Just so we're very obsessive with having everything accounted for so that there is no doubt that no vote was unduly put into the ballot box. Same thing happens with delivery of results. Delivering results in a timely fashion is what can give people the most trust. In Mexico, we have 3 systems put in to be able to deliver results. 2 preliminary, 1 definite system. First one, rapid count. Instead of having exit polls in Mexico, the electoral authority estimates the results with 95% reliability in a statistical manner with randomly selected polling stations with a group of experts to be able to identify the trends in the results of the election. And they are provided by the electoral authority. We do not rely on companies. We do not rely on news media outlets. It's the authority itself who gives this information. Then we have the preliminary results. We get the tally sheets from every single one of the polling stations in the country. The night of the election, we digitalize it. We not only add them up, but we also put the image of the tally sheet of every single polling station so anybody can check that the results that are put into the system are exactly the results that are in the tally sheet. Then, the Wednesday after the elections, we start the definite count, where we're going to have the definite results, which have to be ended by Sunday after the elections. It's 1 week to have definite electoral results. Again, all the tally sheets are counted. If there was a package that was recounted because of any discrepancy, it's the result of the recount that is valid in front of the political parties with surveillance of the political parties. And there we have the definite results of the elections. 3 times we count the votes, 3 electoral results we give to be able to make it transparent, to make it clear that that is the results that we have. We have never had discrepancies between these different results. And then we have the other set of rules that we already talked about. The finance of political parties, the state-sponsored finance, the auditing of the expenditures of political parties, the new the communications model in which we grant political parties times in media outlets for them to publicize their propaganda. The Institute first distributes the time between political parties, equitably distributes the time. Then it receives the materials from the political parties. Then it gives it to the news media outlets, and then it monitors that or oversees that everything that the news media outlets also comply with the broadcasting of these materials. All of these successive reforms, what they've tried to achieve is to combat distrust, to establish checks and balances, to monitor and oversee every single one of the different parts of the electoral process for people to have fair elections, to have elections which they can trust, results which they can trust. As we already said, the Electoral Institute in Mexico is recognized worldwide because of the efficiency it has. We provide technical assistance to countries in Middle East and Latin America and Africa, sometimes to transition to democracy, sometimes already being established democracies, but because they require technical assistance on what we already do with many checks and balances. And as I'm going back to the first part, as I told you, if it had been 6 months ago, I would stop here. Maybe I would see what the challenges we're facing are right now, but a lot has changed in the last few months, as I said. Starting this year, AMLO, our president, and his political party, Morena, and their allies approved a set of legal reforms that are called the Plan B. Why are they called the Plan B? Because there was a Plan A. What was Plan A? For it to be not a legal reform, but a constitutional reform, which was, of course, way broader than the legal reforms. Because in Mexico, we have this thing that we like a constitution to be very specific. So a lot of our electoral model is in the constitution. It's not only in the laws. So the first idea was to change the constitution, but in Mexico, for you to be able to change the constitution, you require a 2/3 majority. which Morena and its allies did not have. So as they did not have that, what they did have was 50% of the votes. So they could pass, and they passed, an electoral reform without even talking to the opposition. 12 hours after they passed reforms, an 800-page reform on 5 laws and a new law in itself, 12 hours after that, it was approved. I'm not sure if they even read it, but that's, or they're very fast readers. I mean, it's, on the premise of austerity, that is one of the principles promoted by this government, and claims that the electoral system in Mexico is inherently fraudulent, or that it's the most expensive in the world. Let's understand that the inherently fraudulent comes from a president who's always claimed that the 2006 election was fraudulent, which also has Mexico very divided as to if it was or was not fraudulent, okay? That's not something that is, that there's like only one view about that in Mexico. But because of these claims, what the reform does is notably reduce the permanent professional structure, that is like the civil servants, the civil career servants from the Institute in about 80%. And with the technical complexities we have, that is very relevant. You having permanent professional officers in charge of that is very relevant. And it also undermines the INE's autonomy and its sanctioning powers. In this way, it hinders its capability of effectively guaranteeing we can have free and fair elections. Does this mean that we can't have free and fair elections with this change? No, we don't know yet. But we do know that we don't have the same guarantees we had before that reform. Today, the reform has faced harsh criticisms in Mexico, especially from Morena's opponents and from large sectors of civil society. But it is right now being revised by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's first decision has been to suspend the effect of this reform. So right now, it's not in place at this moment, but we have yet to see if the Supreme Court considers it constitutional or unconstitutional, or which parts it considers constitutional or unconstitutional. But the outcome of its analysis will be very relevant, not only for the 2024 presidential elections we're going to have, but for the future of democracy, Mexico's institutional democracy. And as I said earlier, I think that there's many lessons that can be learned from how we in Mexico institutionally built trust on the elections. But there's also learning now of the risks and the backsliding that even the strongest electoral democracies can face. And it's not something that we have only seen in Mexico. We've seen it in many other countries in the region and in the world. And I'm going to close with this. I mean, as a lifelong human rights activist, I've worked in elections in Mexico, in Latin America for 15 years. I know that building free and fair elections can happen, it can flourish, even in surprisingly difficult terrains. But if it's built slowly, if it's built persistently, it can flourish. The problem is that it can cut back terrifyingly quickly. And that is something that I think we all have to learn in the different countries, because we have to be aware of that so that we can actually take care of our democracies and the processes we have that support our democracies. And on this note of uncertainty, I hope I didn't take too much longer than the 25 minutes I had planned to have, but I'll open the floor to any questions or comments, please.
Those with questions would please come down to the 2 microphones. That way the recording can pick up what they have to say.
Thank you, Licenciada. That was a very informative presentation. I'm a 2L at Stanford, and I guess that sounds a lot more functional than the U.S. electoral system and gerrymandering, but I'm curious to hear more about how the one party not having to talk to the opposition to pass the legislature. Obviously, that happens here too with filibustering and court appointments and all of that. But how you think that has an impact on future elections after one party has gotten that dominance, if you see those impacts in future elections, and how much that shapes what's possible even with this comprehensive process.
Thank you. I think that this is something completely atypical in Mexico. In Mexico, the most important decisions, we have them like from, I call it the qualitative majority, 2/3. Like, for example, appointing high officials, you have it 2/3. But in the first election, when I got 2/3, you can put processes in place. But if popular vote decides that a political party has absolutely no opposition, has no need to negotiate, I don't think that is a democratic way of addressing electoral reforms. I believe in democratic dialogue. And democratic dialogue means speaking to the one who does not think alike. But if we saw it in light of the 2021 elections, where they didn't get the absolute majority, the 2/3 majority in the House, they only got a 50% majority. Maybe it was a backlash because of that, or maybe it was just a change in people's mind. But this gives, I think that the citizens have the right to vote whichever direction they think is better. And right now, what I think is positive is they have seen what happens when you have a political party that has such immense amount of power that it literally does not have to speak to the other one. But right now in Mexico, we are in I think, the worst polarization moment that we have had. And when I talk about polarization, I'm not talking about two conflicting views. That is conflict, that is elections. I mean, having two opposite views, that's normal. When I talk about polarization in Mexico, I'm talking about not recognizing the other as a valid speaker, as the beginning and as the end of any discussion. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. You're bad or you're good. Period. What you think doesn't matter, because what you think is inherent to if you're from the bad ones or if you're from the good ones. And that is how we are having conversations in Mexico today. Political conversations, social conversations, economic conversations that have to do with you're good, you're bad. This Plan B that I told you about, it's, I think, the most adjectivated law that we've ever had. I would tell you, I don't think 10% of the people who tell you how bad it is have even the faintest idea what it talks about. But most who criticize this law is, AMLO passed it, it means that it's definitely going to be bad. It's going to hurt Mexico, or AMLO passed it, it's good. I mean, because he did it, if he passed it, it's because it's going to help Mexico. We're going to become a democracy because of that. And that's the conversation you're having, and that worries me more than the institutional processes that are built in with those majorities.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. And I would like to ask, how do you see this to impact the 2024 elections? Do you see it more from a perspective of budget assigned to the parties, or the independency of the councilors as such? And I also have the question on if you see that this is also a danger that we can perceive, for example, from organized crime, because we saw in the past elections that we would see, like, in the news that many of the candidates were attacked, and there was like an intervention by the organized crime. So I would like to see if you see this reform to affect from that way, or I would like to see, like, the first effects that we will see in 2024 from this reform.
Funding the parties will have absolutely no effect, because the legal model for funding parties is in the Constitution, and they cannot change the Constitution. So parties are still going to receive an enormous amount of money, which is what AMLO tried to change from the outset. Independence of the Electoral Commission. We just had 4 new councilors appointed a few weeks ago. One of them being the president, because the president finished his term in the 3rd of April. And was it the best, most transparent process to choose them? No, but I don't think we've ever had any best, more transparent process to choose any of the selections that we had in Mexico. Will they be independent or not? I think that's something we're going to see once we see them in office. And they've been there less than a month. So right now I would not know what to say about that. Influence of organized crime. If this election comes into play, it could even get worse. We do have a problem of influence of organized crime. It's been getting worse in the last few years. It does not have to do with AMLO. It's not because of him. This is something that we've been battling against for a very long time right now. But what we have seen, as like in the most recent elections, is that that the interference of organized crime is intervening more in elections. They used to tend to stay out of the elections just for not to draw attention. Now we've had them openly behind one candidate, or more openly behind another candidate. And why that the reform would have an impact is because if you take away the permanent people that have knowledge, that have expertise in organizing elections, and you change them for temporary public servants, they won't have the experience, the ability to face these new challenges. And that is what could make it even worse. Does that mean that if the Plan B didn't go into effect, we would not have that problem? We'll still have it. It might get worse with Plan B, but it's not something that comes out because of this reform. Is you just undermine the electoral authorities' capacities to address that problem and many other problems that can arise more in a presidential election, more in a country that has the enormous levels of violence that we have in Mexico.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'm Alan Weiner from the law school here. I have two questions, if I may. One, your recitation of the history of the elections. I was struck by the transition from what had been a very party-focused electoral regime, where the parties had important institutional influence. It was a corporatist structure that has now been replaced by, has now given way to what seems to be much more of a personalist and populist system. I'm wondering if that's right, and if so, I'm trying to make sense of what's happening in my own country. Maybe if you can explain why that's happening in Mexico. And then a second question, you mentioned that you kind of study elections and do human rights around the region. Do we see this happening elsewhere in Latin America, this shift away from party and institutional politics and the old corporatist model that we were familiar with in Latin America for decades, to a more personalist and populist approach? Thank you.
I'm going to start with the second one. I think that is something that doesn't have to do. I agree completely with your assessment. We did come from a more party-centered political structure, a more corporativist political structure, and right now we have a completely presidentially centered political party, and a populist too. But this is not something that we are just seeing in Mexico. We have seen it in different countries in the region, left and right. We had maybe not going to the complete presidentially centered party instead of like a party in itself in the US, but you had something similar to that in Brazil with Bolsonaro. You have something very similar to that in El Salvador with Bukele. You don't have that with Ortega in Nicaragua, because with Ortega in Nicaragua, it's a political party that has functioned as a political party that serves in favor of the president, but it's not structured around the figure of a person. you might have that in Colombia with Petro, because the political party that was behind him was, they call it a movement, that is an independent candidate. It's like an organization that promotes an independent candidate that became a political party after that. But because there was a coalition behind Petro, and how he could win was through a coalition, you won't necessarily have the same effect moving forward, because the movement or party that first what's behind him is not the center of his electoral dispute. It's only part of it. Here, even, for example, in Mexico, even though AMLO ran through Morena, it wasn't only Morena, there was a coalition. But the strong party in the coalition was Morena. I mean, there's a very big difference in votes between what Morena got and what the other parties in the coalition got. And that is something that we're seeing very much in the region. How do I explain it in Mexico? I explain it as a result of enormous discontent into the way that the establishment is functioning. Because it's also a movement against the establishment. The establishment being PRI, the establishment being PAN, the establishment even being PRD, that is the third political party that was like one of the three big political parties in Mexico. It was the left wing and was the one that promoted AMLO in the first two elections, not the third one, but the first two. But I think much of these backlashes come because of the enormous discontent there is on how democracy is failing to address other problems that do not have to do with elections. When I'm talking here about democratic transition, I'm talking about electoral democratic transition. Like the formal possibility of changing precedents, of choosing, of electing our own elected representatives. But there's many other things around democracy that have to do with our rights, that have to do with our freedoms, and that are not being addressed by the different countries. And I think that's something we're going to be seeing as trying to find an answer that established political parties are not giving the region. But that's the best approximation to an answer I think I could have come up with.
Decisions being made by interested parties who have a stake in it is one of the veins of government and politics in the United States. I love the idea of the Electoral Commission as you describe it, and some of the other institutions having independence and neutrality. To what extent do the Mexican people accept and believe that they genuinely are neutral and independent?
That's a good question. If you would have asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have told you that a lot. Because people identified the electoral authority as the one that permitted us to have alternation in Mexico, to break the 70-year regime. The IFE, that is the origin of the current INE, was created in 1994 and strengthened in 1996. The first presidential election that we had with a completely autonomous electoral body, we had alternation. The first election. And in Mexico, you see them hand to hand. The fact that you had IFE and that you had the alternation. The thing is, right now, with all the claims that the current president is making on how INE is an inherently fraudulent electoral authority, that we have had no democratic processes at all in Mexico, that all of our elections have been fraudulent, and in a very polarized society, this can impact the way people perceive it, the electoral authority, and the need you have for an autonomous body that is not an interested party in the organizing of the election. And that is why the structure, the permanent structure of the INE is so relevant. We've had better and worse counselors, electoral counselors in Mexico, and nothing has happened. Because the strength of the institution lies on the people who actually organize the elections. The electoral counselors are not who physically organize the election. They govern the election, but they don't organize the election. And it's, if you have the strength in those who in terrain organize the election, that is something that builds trust among people because that's the ones that they have closest to them. If you take away the people that are there, you can have a very big backlash. If I told you through polls, INE is one of the most respected institutions that we have in Mexico. It's like something close to, I think it was 56% last time they polled, but it came down from 64. Because of, and I think it has to do with this fight that the president has against INE, and a fight that in both sides is completely polarized. And those who defend INE has never had any problem in its life. I mean, it's been the best institution we could have made, and it's perfect, which is it's not true either. But the other side, there's nothing good that is done. We have never counted votes well, and that is not true either. So, but we have that tension right now in Mexico, and how it will result, I really don't know.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Alvin. I'm a sophomore studying poli-sci. One question I had to was, take California, for example, that has some of the most stringent election laws in the country and finance laws. We have a very active Fair Political Practices Commission that sort of plays the same role. We have state financing mechanisms too for candidates running for local office. Given that, we also have sort of a similar issue outlined with, obviously, it's not an issue, depends on how you look at it, but a supermajority, right? In the state legislature, and that means that, for example, Republicans have absolutely no stake in policymaking in California at all. They're not even considered in any legislation that's passed through. Depending on what side you're on, that's either for the better or for the worse. But that I guess that poses the other question of beyond just strong electoral institutions. A critical part of democracy is that popular cultural engagement and that cultural rhetoric around democratic and civic participation. So I'm curious what your perspective is on that. If the National Electoral Institute in Mexico has sort of done some work on that, about educating citizenry about what healthy civic engagement looks like, why political discourse is important, why democratic engagement is important.
I'm just going to add to something you said. It's not only having a strong authority, it's also having fair processes. When I try to refer to the different processes we have, the center of those processes are not that the authority is strong. The center of those processes are that they have checks and balances within them to avoid bias. Because when you're talking about electoral process, you're talking about the transmission of power. And power is what's at stake. Everybody is going to try to pull the sheet to their side precisely to get power. But when we're thinking about electoral-related systems or electoral systems, we have to see them a little bit more holistically as to how to put the right incentives in place to actually get the best result possible, which the best result is not who wins and who loses. The best result is that it actually reflects in the best way the will of the people who made that decision. That's like the logic behind an electoral system. In Mexico, now going to the other part of your question, in Mexico we do a lot of civic education, to provide to try to teach people the importance of democracy, democratic processes, of having a democratic dialogue. Has that worked too much? I don't know. I'm not sure. I honestly would not be able to tell you that. Will people vote another way because they have the idea that democracy will be strengthened if you do this, if you have checks and balances or not? That changes from time to time and from the needs that people have. because there's also needs that are what motivate people to vote in a certain direction, or beliefs that make people vote in a certain direction. And if you ask half the Mexican population, they would tell you there's absolutely no problem in having no checks and balances, because Morena expresses the will of the people. And because Morena expresses the will of the people, they have the right to do anything they want, no matter what. If they stomp on the opposition, it doesn't matter, because people elected them to do that. Half the population would tell you that. The other half of the population would tell you that, no, we need to have checks and balances because if you have unfettered power. Of course, that other half of the population includes the PRI, who had no problem when it was them who had that power. And that's something that tends to happen very much in politics. I see the things in the way they affect me. If I am the one in the losing side, I will not accept the procedure. But if I'm one in the winning side, it might not look that bad after all. And that's something that we can't be blind to when we think of how we can get better results.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that Mexico has very strict rules regarding political advertising, and in order to balance the situation between the candidates. I was wondering, what is the approach that Mexico has regarding political advertising online, and if that is being used to circumvent those rules, because you mentioned that mainly the rules were for broadcasting. And also, I wanted to know, how do you balance like the spontaneous shows of support to candidates with the free speech and these strict rules? Thank you.
Okay, they're very good questions, they're complex questions. Let me try to give the simplest answer possible. Yes, we have very strict rules for political ads in radio and TV. When I say in radio and TV, I'm saying in radio and TV. We do not have the same such strict rules for online propaganda or for offline propaganda that is not on radio and TV. Why were those such strict rules placed on radio and TV? Because we have an enormous concentration of media stations in Mexico. 95% of the privately controlled media outlets are controlled by two companies, Televisa and Televisión Azteca. They can control what people, when those rules were made in 2007, they literally controlled what people could see, what people could hear, what people could know. If they decided that they would not give voice to a political candidate, that political candidate was out of the picture, because of the decision of the TV and radio, especially TV media stations. Now, regarding online propaganda, we have exactly the same approach we would have on offline propaganda. That was not radio and TV. That is, you can have all the propaganda you want as long as you don't exceed the expenditure caps that are set for a certain election, as long as you don't advertise outside of the time frame that is permitted. For example, during campaigns, if you advertise your campaign before the campaigns, it's prohibited. If you do it the last 3 days after the campaign has ended, and before the election day, there's 3 days that we call it a period of silence. And in those 3 days, you can have absolutely no propaganda. Online is way more complicated, because you can have things online that were posted or that were tweeted or that were put online before that occurred. But what you can't have is anything that would be new. And so is it used to circumvent? It's used to circumvent in the exact same way that they try to circumvent any rule that you place. And that is by trying not to appear as the person who is financing something. In Mexico, we sometimes have like political ads on the street, like those, the ones that are like really huge on the street. And They literally, you have 10 that are identical, and the political parties will tell you, no, it wasn't us. It was our supporters who liked that specific ad, so they placed it themselves. 10 supporters, the same ad. They're very good at thinking exactly the same way. But that's what they try to do. They try to do the same thing with online propaganda, trying not to appear as the person who bought those ads. We have the Electoral Institute has a very fluid relationship with platforms, especially with Meta, to receive information about political ads because it's the app with more, the platform with more penetration in Mexico. And how to balance spontaneous shows of support versus freedom of speech. We've had many cases, well, not many, but a few cases of that in Mexico. And we have differentiated two things. When you have enough elements to prove that there is a coordinated campaign behind those shows of support. For example, we had football players, soccer players, showing support for a political party, the days of silence, but using the exact same words, one and the other, to show support for that political party with the exact same hashtags, with the exact same everything, and there was information that they had been paid to do that. There we're not talking about spontaneous freedom of speech. We're talking about propaganda. That is sanctioned. That has to be even added up to the expenditures. If somebody says, I think that Michael is a wonderful candidate, he has the right to say it. And we can't do nothing. We can't do anything about it, even if he says it in a way that we could even think that maybe was not completely spontaneous. If we don't have elements to prove that it's not spontaneous, it's part of the ways that they circumvent rules.
Well, that's a lovely note, Dan. Thank you very much, and thank you for such interesting questions.